Germany ended the Second World War with weapons that looked like they belonged in the future. They were developing the A9-A10, a multi-stage ballistic missile, and they actually deployed the Messerschmitt Me-262, the world's first operational jet-powered fighter plane. So with this kind of massive technological leap, why did they lose? Because while German factories were designing weapons from the future, the military was bleeding out in the present. The German war machine simply ran out of time. By the summer of 1942, the myth of an invincible, lightning-fast German victory was already dead. The previous winter, relentless Soviet resistance and sub-zero temperatures had frozen the German advance just miles outside of Moscow. To regain their lost momentum and secure the raw fuel necessary to fight a multi-year war, the German High Command made a strategic pivot. They redirected their forces toward a specific target, a decision that would act as a massive sinkhole, ultimately swallowing 300,000 of their own men. This new summer offensive was codenamed Operation Blue. It had two main objectives. The first was highly practical: capture the rich oil fields of the Caucasus to fuel the German tanks and planes. The second was purely psychological: seize the industrial city sitting on the Volga River, a city bearing the Soviet dictator's name, Stalingrad. To accomplish this, the massive invasion force was split. While the bulk of the troops headed south toward the oil, Army Group B, led by General Friedrich Paulus and his 6th Army, peeled off to the east. Looking at this operational map, you can see the main German spearhead dividing. Paulus took a staggering amount of force with him: hundreds of thousands of infantrymen, over 500 tanks, and immense support from the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force. A grand strategic campaign meant to cripple the Soviet economy was now compressing. Hitler's obsession with a namesake propaganda victory forced his best, highly mechanized units to converge on a single, inescapable point on the map. The assault began from the air. In late August, the Luftwaffe blanketed the city with incendiary and high-explosive bombs. Within days, the vital Russian supply barges on the Volga River were sunk, and the city itself was reduced to a jagged landscape of shattered concrete and ash. But that destruction worked against the attackers. Soviet General Vasily Choykov, commanding the 62nd Army, realized that collapsed buildings formed perfect defensive fortifications. He ordered his troops to hug the enemy, keeping Soviet lines so close to German positions that the Luftwaffe couldn't drop bombs without hitting their own men. The conflict devolved into what soldiers called the War of the Moles. The German military was engineered for sweeping, open-field tank maneuvers, but here they were forced into brutal, close-quarters street combat. Control over a single ruined apartment block or a factory floor could change hands a dozen times in 1 week. The ruins also provided perfect cover for Soviet snipers. Marksmen like Vasily Zaitsev turned the debris into a lethal hunting ground, systematically picking off German officers and draining the morale of the advancing infantry. By bombing the city into oblivion, the Germans neutralized their own armor. They traded their greatest advantage, mechanized mobility, for a static, grinding war of attrition they were structurally unequipped to win. While General Paulus poured his veteran shock troops into the meat grinder to capture 90% of the city center, he neglected the wider strategic picture. He left his massive flanks dangerously exposed. This map highlights the fatal imbalance in the Axis lines. You can see the dense concentration of the German 6th Army packed tightly inside the city itself. Meanwhile, the sprawling northern and southern flanks are held by poorly equipped, overstretched Romanian, Hungarian, and Italian divisions. In some sectors, only 4 soldiers guarded a full kilometer of territory. The Soviet command saw the weakness. Instead of heavily reinforcing the center, they launched Operation Uranus. Massive armored columns smashed through the brittle Allied defenses to the north and south, completely ignoring the city and sweeping around in a massive pincer movement. The Axis flanks dissolved in a matter of days. As Soviet T-34 tanks linked up behind Badernan mines, the hunter suddenly became the hunted. Nearly 300,000 Axis soldiers were entirely cut off from the rest of their forces. Hitler's hubris transformed his most powerful offensive spearhead into a besieged island. permanently trapping his best army behind rapidly expanding Soviet lines. Inside the pocket, the reality of the encirclement set in immediately. As winter temperatures plummeted, the trapped Sixth Army faced rampant starvation, freezing conditions, and rapidly depleting ammunition reserves. Paulus had a brief window to attempt an armored breakout, but Hitler expressly forbade it. He ordered the army to hold their ground, relying on a promise from his aviation commanders that the Luftwaffe could supply the entire encircled force from the sky. That promise was a mathematical impossibility. The operation required hundreds of tons of supplies daily, but lethargic transport aircraft like the Junkers Ju-52 were easily picked off by aggressive Soviet fighters. Combined with lethal winter weather, the air bridge completely collapsed. The men inside the city were abandoned. They were fighting two enemies simultaneously: the advancing Red Army outside and the freezing, calculated indifference of their own high command. By late January 1943, the Sixth Army had ceased to function as a military force. Survival meant huddling in the frozen basement ruins of the factories they had spent months trying to capture. On January 30th, Hitler sent Paulus a message promoting him to the rank of Field Marshal. Since no German Field Marshal had ever been taken alive in battle, the promotion was a thinly veiled directive: commit suicide rather than become a prisoner. Paulus refused. The next day, rather than killing himself for a regime that had sacrificed him, he surrendered his headquarters. The freezing, starving remnants of the Sixth Army laid down their weapons. The total destruction of the Sixth Army permanently crippled Germany's ability to mount large-scale offensives on the Eastern Front. From this point forward, they would be fighting a relentless, defensive retreat. And this is why those futuristic German jets and ballistic missiles never won the war. By entering the conflict early, leaders like Winston Churchill ensured the clock was ticking against Germany. In the frozen rubble of Stalingrad, Soviet blood ultimately ran that clock out. By the time Hitler's advanced technology was ready, the human resources he needed to deploy it had already been left behind in the snow.